My guest at this time is acclaimed author Curt Smith. He includes the book, George H.W. Bush, Character at the Core. He also served as a speechwriter for President Bush number 41 and wrote more speeches for him than any other of Bush's speechwriters. We want to get his thoughts on the passing of President Bush and what he sees as Bush's legacy as president and beyond. And Curt, thanks so much for being with us, especially on such a difficult occasion.
Great, I appreciate it. Thank you.
President Bush, of course, had been in declining health for some time, as many people know, and of course he just suffered the passing of his wife Barbara back in April, so his death is not really considered a surprise, but what was your reaction upon hearing the news?
Well, I was awoken about midnight, actually, by my wife and I had gone to sleep, and we were woken by our daughter, who had heard it on television. And so the news, as you suggest, was not unexpected. He had been in ill health, and Barbara's death had been a jolt. But the news was a jolt of his death, because he'd been with us for so long, and with me in a personal sense, but with the nation as well, dating back to 94 years, really our oldest living former president. And, of course, he and Barbara, Mrs. Bush, had set a presidential record easily for having the longest marriage in years, 73 years. My goodness, many Americans don't reach that age. I may not. And, it's an astonishing record of longevity and of decency, of honor, of rectitude, of achievement, of patriotism, of all of the attributes that we would like to think of as quintessentially American. And that is what I think of when I think of him. Even though he traversed the globe and was an achieved and an enormously esteemed diplomat, he really was an exceptional American. And he was proud of that. He was a patriot to the bone, a war hero, of course, who almost lost his life at age 20 in the Second World War. And there were just so many different parts of the extraordinary odyssey that he took to our benefit.
Curt, how and when did you meet him and come to work for him?
I met him just before I came to work for him in late 1988. I had worked for President Reagan, writing for several cabinet secretaries. I was a senior speechwriter throughout a number of years in the 1980s, and of course had met him socially, but not as enough to say that we knew each other. But that changed when, after having written for President Reagan through his cabinet secretaries, my name was put in, and I put my name in for a slot as a speechwriter. He, of course, had succeeded President Reagan, had won, in effect, a third Reagan term, which is quite a rarity in and of itself in the 1988 presidential campaign. So Bush was looking for writers that had not necessarily written for Reagan in the Oval Office as a speechwriter. And so I gave him some writing samples, and I guess he was not unimpressed, because I was chosen as one of 5 writers. And the day after he was inaugurated in January of 1989, we held our first staff meeting. And by then I had already written several books on baseball, which was easily his favorite sport, loving it since he first picked up a baseball bat, swung it at age 5, as he later told me, and said to himself, baseball has everything. So he looked at me that January day in 1989 and said, Curt, I'd rather quote Yogi Berra than Thomas Jefferson. So this was truly in my wheelhouse. But later I found out to my eternal shame that he knew more Berra-isms than I did. So that was our first meeting, and I guess it was an omen of good things to come, at least for me. I hope for him.
And that leads me right into my next question about how he likes his speeches to be crafted. So I don't know how many Yogi Berra quotes ended up in public statements, but give us a little more of an idea of what it was like to write speeches for him. What did he like to see? What did he not like to see?
Well, he once told me that he was not Ronald Reagan, and he couldn't be if he wanted to be. And he was right on both scores. He wasn't Ronald Reagan, and he could not have been Ronald Reagan, and he didn't want to be Ronald Reagan. Not that he didn't have enormous admiration and tenderness toward the Gipper. They became the best of friends at the end of 8 years of their great teamship in the 1980s. But rather, Bush knew that Reagan had placed enormous emphasis on the spoken word. I mean, that was the Gipper's leitmotif. That's what we knew him for. Bush's idea of governance was somewhat different. The spoken word was one aspect, but there were involved also items of scholarship. Not that the Gipper wasn't. He was. But Bush added to that a career in diplomacy, which Reagan, of course, did not. And Bush had, I would say, safe to say, had stronger bona fides when it came to foreign policy. So it was simply a different approach to how you approached the office of being president. And he didn't spend as much time on his speeches from A to Z as Reagan did. By that I mean, if it was an address at Pearl Harbor, as Bush gave, for example, on the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor in 1991, an emotional speech to Bush and to me, or a just war speech, or an address to the United Nations, something of this ilk. Bush would get very deeply involved and as extensively as he needed to. However, if it were a more minor speech, let's say a 10-minute greeting the future farmers of America in the Rose Garden, he would not edit the speech. He would not become involved with it. He might not look at it until almost upon giving it. Reagan always would become much more intimately involved. I think were Bush to have it to do over again, in fact, I know this to be the case because we discussed it, he would have devoted more time to his speeches because he paid a price for a lack of craft, let us say. They weren't as poetic. They could have been, perhaps, but Bush simply did not devote the time to that, to the delivery of the speeches, not simply the substance. Reagan always did, of course, and it showed.
Obviously, a momentous 4 years of the Bush 41 presidency. You had the Gulf War, you had the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the Soviet Union, as well as many other moments, some of which we'll talk about in a minute. But what speeches and what moments of that administration jump to mind first when you think of those 4 years?
Well, I think of the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and made it Iraq's 19th so-called province, and Bush said this aggression will not stand, and he declared war on Hussein, and he crafted the largest Allied armada since World War II. It was a spectacular personal triumph, a great triumph for him as a peacemaker, because it restored peace at least tangentially to that era, and it showed what can be done with a president who crafts, who really knows his stuff, and who has that background in foreign policy, which Bush did. I think he and Richard Nixon, it seems to me, have the deepest background in foreign policy of any president dating back to Franklin Roosevelt, including Eisenhower, of course. But I think that the whole speeches in the latter part of 1990 and also dating into 1991, that whole run-up to the invasion against Hussein. The Pearl Harbor speech, as I mentioned, Bush had been 17 when the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. So here he is going back the half-century anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack, and he's giving a speech. So even though he's 67, inside, emotionally, he's 17. And it was an exceedingly difficult speech for him to give. And yet at the end, when he said at the end, "God bless the United States of America," and then almost whispered the words, "the most wondrous land on earth," he was enormously moved, and it enormously moved his audience. So that was another speech. I think the Americans for Disabilities Act, which I had the pleasure of and the privilege of writing, people weren't talking about disabilities. Bush was way of the crowd when it came to this enormous province of a president. Today we think of it as something the president by default becomes involved with. They weren't saying that back then. Bush was a pioneer. Bush also, in terms of a rewrite of the Clean Air Act, he had a great environmental streak. He really thought of himself as being in the Theodore Roosevelt vein, if you would, of conservation in the Republican Party. Those are the speeches that, to me, really leap out.
Curt, a couple questions, a couple minutes left in our conversation here. Obviously, he was a one-term president, lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. Ross Perot getting in the race certainly didn't help him either. What was the sense in the White House, not only at the loss, but what was responsible for the loss? Was it the change of mind on the tax cut pledge and so forth? What ultimately
that didn't help. Bush knew, in fact, that when he reneged on his vow, "Read my lips, no new tax," that would hurt him. What he thought, however, was that he would get credit for the blooming of the economy, and the economy did bloom. We had a 4.2% increase in economic growth in the final quarter of 1992, that election year. But by then, sadly, he was talking to a closed jury. Who did us in? We did. We didn't govern in a conservative enough manner to pacify the people who had voted for us, the conservative wing of the Republican Party and of Middle America. That's how Bush had won 40 states in 1988 over Michael Dukakis. It was as close as America could come to a third Reagan term. They wanted a conservative president. Too often we didn't give them conservative policy. So they found an alternative. And the alternative, you've just mentioned him. His name was Ross Perot. Perot got 19% of the vote. Almost all of that vote, in my view, would have gone to George H.W. Bush versus Bill Clinton if that election had been a two-way election. That was, in many ways, if you ask almost anyone that was a member of the Bush White House, they will tell you that 1992 was one of the worst years, if not the worst, of their life, because he lost to an inferior candidate, or I should say to a better candidate than Bill Clinton. He was a better politician. But I think Clinton was an inferior president to Bush, particularly in foreign policy, particularly in matters of honor and of rectitude. I think the record is very clear on that. And I think that Bush reacted in a way that's so illuminative and revealing of him. He didn't blame us. He didn't blame the writers. Maybe if he had better writers, Bush would have won. He blamed himself. He felt that he let the team down. And for one of the few periods of his life, he went into, if not a funk, at least a period of deep reflection, of introspection. How could it have happened? He felt that he had let down the American people. This is why I take such great pride and a sense of reward on Bush's behalf in the extraordinary outpouring of love and affection, respect, admiration that you see forthcoming from the American people. Bush experienced in the last decade of his life, I think the American people came to see the person that they had not seen in the last couple of years of his presidency, but that we had seen all along. And that I find it very difficult to put how good I feel about that in words, because they saw the man that we saw and the person that we came to love.
Yeah, press coverage 2018, a little different than press coverage 1992.
Yeah, where were the newsies when we needed them?
To say the least. Lastly, of course, he had an extensive post-presidential life, 25 years.
Yes, sure did.
Any personal time with him over the last quarter century that stands out, especially today?
Oh, a lot, because after the 4 presidential years, I headed his speech staff on a voluntary basis for the next 4 to 5 years as he raised money by giving speeches, so for his presidential library. And so I wrote, speeches, including the eulogy that he gave for Ronald Reagan's funeral in 2004. So I got to know him much better after the presidency than I ironically had enough during the presidency, but because you're a lowly writer and he's running the free world, so you don't have the time. But yes, and there were so many wonderful memories. But I think that people would be interested in when he turned 75. he began skydiving, parachuting. And he did so to honor the two crewmates of his plane that had died when he had almost died, when his plane was shot down by the Japanese in 1944. He did it to honor them. And the reaction was so tumultuous and so favorable, he decided to do it every 5 years. So he did it at 80, and he did it at 85, and he did it a little help, admittedly, but he still did it at age 90. And I remember talking to him the first time that he did it. He'd just come back from a foreign trip, and we were writing a speech. And he said, I was worried that when I first skydove to honor my crewmates, that people would laugh. They said, "What are you doing?" But he said that's not been true at all. He said people are interested in it. He said when I went abroad, and he'd just been to the United Kingdom and to France and Germany and several other countries he named, and he talked to the leaders of those countries. They all wanted to know, what was it like? Did you feel suspended? Did you feel magic? Did you feel elevated, transfixed? What was it like? And there was this sense of wonderment. And again, this was Bush the teenager. This was Bush who I used to call America's oldest teenager because he was forever young. And that marvelous sense of eternal youth, which you could not help but sense if you were around him. That's what I'll remember about George Bush.
Curt, beautiful recollection, and for anyone to get a deeper look at that presidency and his life, George H.W. Bush, Character at the Core, is the book that Curt wrote just a few years ago. Curt, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for helping us take a look back at a truly amazing and American life. Well,
George, Greg, you've been so kind, and again, my deep thanks for giving me the chance to talk about someone that I so deeply admire.
Author Curt Smith, many books on sports and baseball, as he mentioned there. But George H.W. Bush, Character at the Core, is the book about President Bush, and he was also the leading speechwriter for President Bush from 1989 to 1993. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.